I never expected to become a farmer at 35, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. One minute, I was grinding away at an accounting firm in the city, barely surviving on caffeine and regret, and the next, I was standing on my grandfather's land, holding a certified letter that threatened to take everything away. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I read it again, my coffee growing cold on the kitchen table. The Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association, a development that didn't even exist when my grandfather bought this land, was claiming they owned the mineral rights beneath my farm and would begin excavation in 4 weeks. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. They had no right to my land. This farm had been in our family for 3 generations, a piece of Willow Creek's history long before Sycamore Heights and its neatly trimmed hedges ever existed. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number on the letterhead, my pulse pounding in my ears. After being transferred 3 times, a clipped voice answered. Karen Holloway speaking. HOA President. The woman in charge. Ms. Holloway, I said, keeping my voice steady, I'm calling about this letter claiming the HOA owns mineral rights to my property. There must be some mistake. No mistake at all, Mr. Carter. Her tone was as polished and sharp as glass. Your grandfather signed the agreement 2 years ago. Our geological survey found significant limestone deposits beneath your eastern field, and excavation is set to begin next month. The paperwork is quite clear. I gripped the phone tighter. My grandfather would never. Perhaps you didn't know him as well as you thought. Her voice turned smug. The agreement is legally binding. Have a nice day. The call disconnected before I could say another word. I sat there, stunned, listening to the hollow silence of the farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, I saw the fields bathed in morning light, the same land I had run through as a kid, the same orchard where Grandpa Henry had taught me how to read the soil, tend the trees, and respect the seasons. He would have cut off his own hand before signing away a single inch of this farm. Something wasn't right. That afternoon, I drove to the edge of my property, where my land met Sycamore Heights. The neighborhood had sprung up just 5 years ago, rows of identical 2-story houses, manicured lawns, white mailboxes all standing at perfect attention. It felt sterile, artificial. Nothing like the farm, nothing like what Grandpa Henry had built with his bare hands. A woman kneeling in a flower bed near the fence stood as I approached, pulling off her gardening gloves. She looked to be in her late 50s, sharp eyes studying me. You must be Henry's grandson, she said with a sad smile. I'm Barbara Watson. I was his neighbor. I nodded. Did you know him well? As well as anyone, I suppose, she said. He brought me fresh peaches every summer. Her eyes flicked to her front door, and then, in a lower voice, she added, be careful with that HOA. Karen's had her eye on your property since they broke ground here. What do you mean? I asked, my heart pounding. Barbara glanced around as if checking for listening ears. She's always talking about expanding the community footprint. Your grandfather refused to sell, even when they offered him way above market value. Before I could press further, the distant slam of a car door made Barbara stiffen. She shoved her gloves back on and forced a laugh. I should get back to my flowers. The HOA only allows certain approved plants, got cited last month for unauthorized hostas. As I turned back toward my farmhouse, a silver SUV rolled slowly down the street, its tinted windows flashing in the afternoon sun. The driver, a woman with immaculate gray hair and a face carved from stone, locked eyes with me as she passed. Karen Holloway. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, sifting through old papers, tax forms, seed catalogs, anything that might explain what the hell was going on. At 2 a.m., my hands landed on a thick folder labeled Property Documents. Inside, I found it, the original deed from 1963, when my grandfather had bought this land. I read through every line carefully, my pulse quickening with each word. The mineral rights were never separated. The land, above and below, belonged solely to my grandfather. Which meant Karen was lying. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. If this was fraud, I needed proof. And if Karen Holloway thought I would roll over and let her steal my family's farm, she had no idea what kind of fight she had just picked. The county records office smelled like old paper and stale coffee, a place where history was buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. A balding man with wire-rimmed glasses sat behind the counter, flipping through a dog-eared newspaper. His name tag read Ray Parker. "Can I help you?" he asked, barely glancing up. "I need to see all records related to my grandfather's property. Mineral rights, transfers, anything filed in the last 2 years." Ray set his paper down and adjusted his glasses. "Name on the property?" "Henry Carter." He typed into the computer, his fingers slow but deliberate. A few minutes later, he frowned and turned the screen toward me. "Here's the original deed from 1963, he said, pointing at a scanned document. All mineral rights were included with the sale. No separation clause, which means he still owned them when he passed, I finished. Ray nodded. "Should've. But," he clicked a few more times, then muttered, "Huh. That's odd." He swiveled the screen back to himself, frowning harder. "There's a transfer of mineral rights here. Filed 2 years ago. Signed by Henry Carter, giving all subsurface rights to Sycamore Heights Community Development Corporation." My stomach dropped. "Can I see it?" Ray printed a copy and handed it over. I stared at the signature at the bottom. Henry Carter, but something was off. The letters were too stiff, too deliberate. Grandpa's distinctive looping H was missing, replaced by a clumsy, uneven scrawl. "This isn't right," I muttered. "Do you have anything else with his signature for comparison?" Ray scratched his chin. "Let me check." He disappeared into a back room, returning a few minutes later with an old tax appeal form from 5 years ago. When he placed it next to the mineral rights transfer, the difference was undeniable. The real signature flowed smoothly, confident despite the shaky strokes of age. The one on the mineral transfer looked forced, like someone had copied it from memory but couldn't quite get it right. A cold wave of realization hit me. This was a forgery. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw my Aunt Linda's name on the screen. "I got your message," she said when I answered. "About Grandpa supposedly signing away mineral rights. That never happened." "You're sure?" "Positive. And there's something else," she hesitated, as if debating whether to say it. "That signature, it's dated April 15, 2022, right?" "Yeah." "Ethan," she said, her voice tightening, "your grandfather was in the hospital then. He had his stroke on April 2nd and wasn't released until the 27th. He couldn't even hold a spoon for weeks, let alone sign a legal document." I gripped the phone tighter, the full weight of it sinking in. There was no way he signed that document. "Then that means..." "It's fake," she finished. "Karen forged it." I pulled into my driveway, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Grandpa and I had spent countless evenings out here, sitting on the porch, watching fireflies dance over the tall grass. I had promised myself I would protect this farm, and now, someone was trying to steal it right out from under me, with a fraud so blatant, it would be almost laughable if it weren't so terrifying. A low hum cut through the silence. I turned toward the eastern field and felt my pulse spike. A drone. It hovered just above the treetops, its blinking red light glowing like an unblinking eye, watching me. I took a step forward, and it abruptly veered left, speeding back toward Sycamore Heights. They were spying on me. I clenched my jaw. If Karen and her HOA thought I was just going to roll over, they had no idea what kind of fight they were in for. But first, I needed more proof. The next morning, I drove straight to Sheriff Greg Dawson's office. The station was quiet, the kind of place where the biggest crime on record was probably some high schooler stealing beer from the gas station. Dawson, a stocky man in his 50s with a face that had seen too many political favors, leaned back in his chair as I laid out the documents. "This is fraud," I said. "That signature isn't my grandfather's, and I have hospital records proving he was physically incapable of signing anything on that date." Dawson sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Look, Ethan, I get that this is a mess, but you need to understand, Karen's brother-in-law is Rick Holloway, county commissioner. And he's got a lot of friends in high places," Dawson said, rubbing his temple. "I'll look into it, but don't expect this to go anywhere fast." I stared at him. "You mean you're not going to do anything?" "I didn't say that," he muttered, glancing at the clock. "I'm saying these kinds of cases take time. And you're up against people who know how to bury problems like this." I could hear the unspoken warning. "Walk away before you make enemies you can't handle." But I wasn't walking away. Not when Karen was already moving to take my land. Not when they were watching me. Not when this was the last piece of my grandfather's legacy, and I'd be damned if I let her steal it. That night, I sat in the kitchen with a stack of legal printouts, my laptop open to a dozen articles about property law, mineral rights, and fraud cases. My eyes burned from reading, but I forced myself to keep going. I needed three things. Undeniable proof that the signature was forged. Evidence of who forged it. Leverage, something powerful enough to fight back against Karen's lawyers, money, and connections. And I needed it fast, because in less than 4 weeks, the bulldozers were coming. I drove through the winding roads toward Sycamore Heights, my fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. The weight of the documents in the passenger seat, the proof of the forgery, the hospital records, the blatant fraud, felt like a loaded gun, ready to fire. But evidence meant nothing without action. If I wanted to stop Karen Holloway and her sham HOA, I needed backup. That was why I was headed to a secret meeting with Sycamore Heights residents, the people living under Karen's iron fist. They weren't farmers, but they had their own battles: unfair fines, HOA corruption, unexplained fees draining their bank accounts. And if there was one thing I knew about people, it was this: nothing unites like a common enemy. The meeting spot was a small coffee shop in the next town over, a place far enough from Sycamore Heights that no HOA board members would casually stroll in. I parked and stepped inside, immediately spotting the group in a back corner. 7 people sat around a scratched wooden table, their faces tense with frustration. A woman with bright eyes and a determined expression stood as I approached. "Ethan Carter?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm Jessica Miller," she said, shaking my hand. "We all have problems with how Karen runs things, but what she's doing to your farm, that crosses a line." I took a seat, setting my folder of documents on the table. "How did you find out about my situation?" I asked. A man with salt and pepper hair leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "I'm David Whitman, retired attorney. Margaret announced at the last HOA meeting that they had acquired mineral rights to a neighboring property for a community expansion project." My stomach churned. She was bragging about it? "Oh, she was gloating," said Rebecca Lane, a woman in her 40s with a clenched jaw. "And get this, she pushed through a special assessment fee $1,200 per household for legal fees and site preparation." I stiffened. "She's making homeowners pay to steal my land?" "She's making us pay for her crimes," Rebecca snapped. "We had no idea what the money was really for until James," she gestured to David, "did some digging." David tapped the stack of papers in front of him. "That's when we found out about the forged signature. But that's not all. He slid a financial report across the table. Karen has been draining the HOA's emergency funds. We suspect at least $200,000 is unaccounted for. I exhaled sharply. You think she's embezzling? Jessica nodded. Absolutely. And if she's stealing from homeowners while using fraudulent contracts to expand her influence, she needs to be stopped. I flipped open my own folder and spread out the documents. I have proof the signature was forged. I have medical records proving my grandfather was in the hospital on the date she claims he signed the transfer. David studied the documents carefully. This is criminal fraud, he said. But you need irrefutable proof. Have you contacted the sheriff? I scoffed. Sheriff Dawson plays golf with Karen's brother-in-law. You think he's going to take me seriously? Jessica leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Then we don't go to the sheriff, not yet. I frowned. What do you mean? We expose her, she said simply. If we bring this to light publicly, news outlets, social media, Karen won't be able to shut it down. The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for her to cover it up. I considered it. Karen had power, but she thrived in the shadows, manipulating people before they realized what was happening. If we yanked the curtain back before she could bury the evidence, she'd have nowhere to hide. David nodded. That's a start, but we also need an expert witness, someone to disprove the mineral rights claim. If we can prove there's no valuable limestone under your farm, we destroy her entire justification for the land grab. My mind clicked into place. Dr. Charlie Foster. I know someone, I said. A geology professor at the State University. If he analyzes the soil and finds nothing special, Karen's entire excuse falls apart. Jessica smiled. Perfect. Rebecca checked her watch. We should go. We don't want to draw attention. As we gathered our things, Jessica suddenly grabbed my arm and whispered, "Wait." I followed her gaze toward the front window. A sedan was parked across the street. The driver was a woman with perfectly coiffed gray hair, pretending to check her phone. Karen. My pulse quickened. She followed me here, I realized. David's face darkened. Then she knows we're organizing against her. If she knows, Rebecca whispered, she might accelerate her plans. I clenched my fists. Then we'd have to move faster. The next morning, I called Dr. Foster and explained the situation. By noon, he was pulling into my driveway in his beat-up Subaru, stepping out with a dust-covered leather bag slung over his shoulder. Damn, Ethan, he said, surveying the farm. Didn't expect you to call me about a property dispute. It's more than that, I said, handing him a printed copy of the HOA's geological survey. They claim my farm has high-value limestone deposits under it. He scanned the page, then let out a sharp laugh. This is garbage. I blinked. What? Ethan, this survey is vague as hell. No depth readings, no core samples. Just a blanket claim that limestone exists. It's meaningless. I exhaled. So you can prove it's a lie. He clapped me on the back. Give me a shovel and some sample tubes. Let's go bust these assholes. That night, while Karen was plotting her next move, Dr. Foster and I were out in the fields digging soil samples. Under the cover of darkness, we worked quickly, gathering evidence that could shatter her entire plan. The first test results came back by morning. Ethan, Charlie said, holding up the data sheet. There's nothing special about this soil. I felt a wave of satisfaction. Then Karen's claim is worthless. Charlie grinned. And we're gonna prove it. But before I could celebrate, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Emergency HOA meeting called for tonight. Topic: Security measures for neighborhood boundaries. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Karen was moving faster than expected. She knew we were coming for her. And now, she was making her next move. The wind howled against the farmhouse as I stood in my kitchen, staring down at the latest text from Jessica Miller. The words burned into my mind. Emergency HOA meeting called for tonight. Topic: security measures for neighborhood boundaries. I didn't need to read between the lines to know what that meant. Karen Holloway was escalating the fight. She wasn't waiting for the courts or for me to build my case. She was making her move now. I grabbed my keys and drove towards Sycamore Heights, my truck rumbling down the back roads. As I approached the pristine community, I parked just beyond the entrance where I wouldn't be seen and walked the rest of the way. The HOA meeting was being held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, modern building that looked more like a corporate office than a neighborhood center. Through the tall windows, I could already see Karen standing at the front of the room, her signature icy stare scanning the crowd. The room was packed, more people than I'd expected. Dozens of homeowners had gathered, all murmuring amongst themselves. Jessica and David Whitman stood near the back, watching tensely. I slipped in and took a seat beside them. Karen cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. "Residents of Sycamore Heights," she began, her voice crisp and authoritative, "we are facing an increasing security threat. A certain individual," her eyes flickered in my direction, but she didn't say my name, "has been trespassing on community-owned land and attempting to stir unrest. I have called this meeting to propose immediate security measures to protect our neighborhood." A man in the front row raised his hand. "What kind of security measures?" Karen smiled, the type of smile that hid daggers behind her teeth. "Effective immediately, we will be installing a perimeter fence along our shared boundary and hiring private security personnel to ensure no further disruptions occur." I stiffened. This wasn't about security. She was trying to fence me out of my own land. A murmur spread through the crowd, and another resident, a woman in her 60s, spoke up. "How much is this going to cost us?" Karen folded her arms. "A temporary special assessment fee of $2,000 per household will be required to cover expenses." The room erupted into outrage. "You can't just force us to pay that," someone shouted. "Why are we paying for this?" another voice demanded. Jessica stepped forward. "Karen, be honest with them. This isn't about security, it's about covering up the fraud you committed to steal Ethan Carter's farm." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face darkened. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said coldly. David held up a stack of documents. "Actually, we do. We have proof that the mineral rights transfer was forged. We have medical records proving Henry Carter was physically incapable of signing anything when you claim he did." Karen's jaw tightened, but she forced a laugh. "This is absurd. If you had any real proof, you would have taken it to the authorities already." David took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "We're filing fraud charges as we speak." The room exploded into hushed whispers. Homeowners turned to each other, doubt creeping into their faces. Karen straightened, regaining her composure. "I have done nothing illegal. And frankly, I don't have time to entertain conspiracy theories. If you refuse to contribute to the security fund, fines will be issued for non-compliance." The meeting ended in chaos. Residents shouted over one another, some storming out while others tried to press Karen for answers. I turned to Jessica and David. "She's panicking." Jessica nodded. "She's losing control." David exhaled. "That means she's going to get desperate. We need to move faster." The next morning, I woke up to something far worse. As I pulled onto the gravel road leading back to my farm, my stomach clenched. My front gate was chained shut, with an orange violation notice plastered across it. I slammed the truck into park and jumped out, ripping the notice down. "Property access restricted pending mineral excavation preparations." I turned as a black SUV rolled up. 2 private security guards stepped out, arms crossed. "Excuse me," I called, stepping toward them. "This is my farm. You need to remove that lock." The taller of the 2 barely spared me a glance. "Orders from the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. No entry without proper authorization." I clenched my fists. "I own this land." The second guard handed me a business card. "Take it up with Ms. Holloway. We're just doing our job." I felt my blood boil. Fine. If Karen wanted to play dirty, so could I. I pulled out my phone and called Sheriff Dawson. It took 20 minutes before he finally pulled up in his cruiser, his expression already resigned. Dawson got out, took one look at the situation, and sighed. "I'm sorry, Ethan." I stepped forward. "No, you're not. You're just pretending you can't do anything about it." Dawson looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. He hesitated before speaking. "Karen filed the proper documents for a temporary land access restriction." I laughed bitterly. "Based on a forged signature." Dawson rubbed his temple. "That's for the courts to decide. For now, the paperwork is legal." I could hear the unspoken warning again. "You're fighting something bigger than you." I took a slow breath. "Then I need copies of those documents." Dawson nodded reluctantly. "I'll see what I can do." As he left, I turned back to the guards. They didn't say anything, but their smirks told me everything. I wasn't going to win this battle through the system. I needed to expose Karen to the world. That night, I met with Jessica, David, and Dr. Charlie Foster at my friend's barn, since I still couldn't enter my own property. Charlie laid out the final results of his soil analysis. "This is it," he said, placing a sheet of paper in front of me. "The proof you need." I skimmed the report. No high-value limestone. No reason for excavation. Karen had built her entire fraud on a lie. David exhaled. "Ethan, if we go public with this, she's done." Jessica nodded. "We need news coverage. Social media. Everything." I clenched my jaw. Karen tried to steal my farm, manipulated my grandfather, framed me for a crime, and locked me out of my own home. She thought she had all the power. But she had no idea what was coming for her. Because I wasn't just fighting back. I was going to burn her entire empire to the ground. The sun was barely up when I chained myself to my tractor and drove straight toward my padlocked front gate, stopping just short of the orange violation notice. News vans were already lining the road, cameras pointed in my direction. Behind them, a growing crowd of Sycamore Heights residents gathered, many holding homemade signs. I stood up on the seat of my tractor, holding a folder high above my head. For weeks, the Sycamore Heights HOA has claimed they own the mineral rights to my family farm, I called out, my voice carrying over the morning air. They locked me out of my own land. They framed me for violations. They tried to destroy my home. But today, the truth comes out. Before I could say more, a black SUV screeched to a halt, and Karen Holloway stormed out, her face red with rage. "Turn those cameras off right now," she barked at the reporters. "This man is trespassing on HOA property." The crowd murmured. Even some of her own residents looked uneasy. "Actually," came a calm voice from behind me, "he's standing on his own land." Dr. Charlie Foster stepped forward, holding a copy of his soil analysis. "I conducted an independent geological survey," he announced. "There are no valuable mineral deposits under this farm. The HOA's claim is based on fabricated science." Karen's eyes flickered, but before she could recover, David stepped up. "We also have forensic proof that the mineral rights contract was forged," he added, holding up enlarged copies of the two conflicting signatures. "And Henry Carter was hospitalized when this was allegedly signed." Medical records confirm he couldn't even hold a pen. The gasps in the crowd were loud this time. A reporter shoved a microphone in Karen's face. "Miss Holloway, how do you respond to these allegations of fraud and forgery?" Karen steeled herself, trying to regain control. "This is absurd. These are just baseless accusations." "Then why is over $200,000 missing from the HOA's emergency fund?" Jessica's voice rang out. Karen's composure cracked. At that moment, sheriff's deputies arrived, pushing through the crowd. Dawson himself stepped forward, holding up a warrant. "Karen Holloway," he said, his voice steady, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement." The crowd exploded into cheers as the deputies cuffed Karen. She struggled, screaming threats. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with." But for once, nobody was listening. Over the next few weeks, everything unraveled. The HOA board was dismantled, residents voted in a new leadership, with Jessica at the helm, and the county rerouted its highway expansion plan, leaving my land untouched. Karen and her allies faced civil lawsuits and criminal charges. And the farm? It thrived. By the next spring, we had built a farmer's market on the land Karen had tried to steal. Sycamore Heights residents came not as enemies, but as neighbors. What was once a battleground became a community. I sat on my rebuilt porch, watching kids run through the fields where Karen had planned to dig her first trench. She saw my land as something to exploit. But I knew its real worth all along. What about you? Have you ever fought against an HOA, or a Karen who thought they owned the world? Share your story below. I bet we'll see who had it worse.